Welcome you all to the book of Joshua. I will just rewind what we have learned in the previous session. Book of Joshua is the sixth book of the Bible. The first part of the book is written by Joshua himself, and after the death of Joshua, someone else compiled and edited this book. The book of Joshua continues the story after the exodus from Egypt. The book chronicles approximately 20 years of Joshua's leadership after Moses appointed him at the end of Deuteronomy. Then we have seen the main characters of the book of Joshua, the Joshua himself, the conqueror, he is the hero, Rahab the prostitute, the heroine, and villain of the story, Achan. The beginning of the book narrates the commissioning of Joshua by God himself. Then Joshua prepares the people for conquering the land. After that, we saw Joshua sending 2 men to spy out the city of Jericho. There comes Rahab. She helped the spies to hide and escape from the city. Then miraculously, they crossed the Jordan River. They reached Gilgal. There they got circumcised and ate the produce of the land. As soon as they ate the produce of the land, the supply of manna that sustained them in the wilderness for 40 years stopped. Then Joshua had an encounter with the commander of the army of the Lord. Then we learned the fall of Jericho. After that victory, they got defeated in Ai. That's because of Achan's sin. Later on, Achan's sin was exposed and the entire family were stoned to death. Further, they destroyed Ai. At Mount Abel and Mount Gerizim, the Israelites renewed their covenant with God. Till this, we covered in the first session. Now let's see the rest of the book. In book of Joshua chapter 10, we can see that they continue their war with the people of the land. You can see that from chapter 10, verse 1 to chapter 11, verse 23. Okay, one unnatural thing happened in this chapter. In this chapter, as I said, one unnatural thing happened. To accomplish the victory over 5 Amorite kings, Joshua commanded the sun to stand still. The sun stopped moving. We know that a sun is not moving, all the revolving around the sun that you have studied in your science book. So in that case, the entire solar system stopped. That is the power of a person who is commissioned by God and fully obedient to the commandment of God. In human history, none other than Joshua stopped the sun. In the map, you can see the 5 Amorite kings killed by Joshua. Look at the map. Gibeon, Jebusite, Jarmuth, Eglon, Lachish, Hebron. These are the 5 Amorite kings killed by Joshua. Likewise, Joshua and the Israelites captured many cities. Also, they defeated the Canaanite kings. The important quality or characteristics of Joshua to be noted here is in all this, Joshua is obeying the commands of the Lord to Moses. See, in all this, whatever God has commanded to Moses, Joshua is obeying it. That's an important point we have to not here. Then chapter 11, verses 16 to 23 gives the summary statement of all the land that Joshua and the Israelites conquered in Canaan. The summary ends like this. In verse 23, we can see, and the land had rest from war. See, the land had rest from war. Then we move forward, comes to chapter 12, the kings conquered by Moses. Chapter 12, 1 to 6, verses 1 to 6, we see the list of the lands and the kings conquered by Moses and the Israelites east of the Jordan River. So the east of the Jordan River was conquered by Moses and the Israelites. And now we move on to the west of the Jordan River. The, verses 7 to 24 list the lands and the 31 kings conquered by Joshua and the Israelites west of the Jordan River. So total 31 kings Joshua has conquered. You can look at the map. In the map, you can see the area occupied by the Israelite after the conquest. Now we move ahead from chapter 13 to chapter 21. See, the mission of Joshua is to conquer and divide the land to the Israelites. The land still unconquered and the command to divide the land. Joshua 13 verse 1 to 7, you can see there are still some more parts of the Canaan to be left unconquered. So God commands Joshua. See, Joshua now, as the journey continues, Joshua is becoming old and God is promising him that there are more to be conquered. So God himself take the initiative and God himself fight for them, for the Israelites. In 13, 1 to 7, we can see the list of unconquered parts of Canaan and the promise of God to drive out the inhabitants of those lands by God himself, and commands Joshua to divide the land of Canaan to 9.5 tribes of Israel. Here Joshua is dividing the land to 9.5 tribes of Israel. You have, when you studied Pentateuch, you have seen that Moses have divided the land to 2.5 tribes of Israelites. That is, the land east of the Jordan given by Moses to Israelites are west, that is the east of Jordan. The tribes are Reuben, Gad, and half tribe of Manasseh. These are the tribes, 2.5 tribes. For them, Moses have divided the land. Now we move forward. The land west of the Jordan given by Eleazar and Joshua to Israelite tribes. So chapter 14, verses 1 to 19, 1 to 19, chapter 19, verse 51, you can see the division of land, or the division of land given to the other 9.5 tribes of the Israelites and Joshua and Caleb. They are the only people still living of the generation that came out of Egypt. They got their individual allotments of land. I'll read out the 9.5 tribes: Judah, Ephraim, the other tribe, the half tribe of Manasseh, Benjamin, Zayman, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan. These are the 9.5 tribes got the portions by Joshua and Eleazar. Now in chapter 20, we see the cities of refuge. In chapter 20, God commands Israel to set aside the cities of refuge. They designate 6 cities of refuge in total. If a person who has killed someone unintentionally can take refuge from those who would seek revenge. See, if by mistake or unintentionally a person is killing someone, that time he can go to the city of refuge and take refuge over there. Okay, so move to chapter 21. Yeah, now in chapter 21 verse 1 to 42 you can see, while giving inheritance the Levites, the priestly tribe possess no inheritance. Why? Because as God promised them, the Lord God of Israel is their inheritance. Okay, so God himself was their inheritance. 48 towns were allotted for them throughout the territory of other tribes, which includes the 6 cities of refuge. So they got 48 towns as their allotment, but they didn't have any possession or inheritance as such, because God himself was their inheritance. Then we'll move to Joshua chapter 21, verse 43 to 45. These verses are a summary statement of the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel concerning the land. Okay, see, we know that we have experienced in our life also. God is a promise keeper. We used to sing that song, like promise keeper. So God is a promise keeper. In this verse 45, you can read like this: not one of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. Whatever promises God has given to his people, every promises is fulfilled. Such a faithful God we serve. Hallelujah. And if you are, then you look at the verses from that's chapter 22, verses 1 to 34. The eastern tribes, Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh, and they were helping. Chapter 1, we have seen that Joshua called these people, these tribes, to help the rest of the tribes, nine and a half tribes to. So now, after the conquering of the land, Joshua told these people to go back to their own territory. So while they were going back, they built an altar in the bank of the Jordan River. So what the other 9.5 tribes thought, that they were going astray from God and they were making a god of themselves and they were worshipping other gods. They thought like that. So the other tribes interpret the building of the altar as rebellion against the Lord and threatened war. But the eastern tribes explain that the altar is meant to serve as a witness in generations to come that they too worship the same God as the rest of Israel. So like then the war prevented. Otherwise, it would have ended up in a war. Then in Joshua chapter 23, we can see Joshua is giving an exhortation. That is from 1 to 16. Joshua has grown old and is about to die. He calls all Israelite to him and exhorts them to obey the commands of the book of the law of Moses, so that they might not be enticed by the nations around them to forsake the covenant. See, Joshua is making sure that all the Israelites are following the commandments of the God. Then we always tell one verse, as for me and my household, we serve the God. So this is the famous proclamation by Joshua. He was telling the people, whatever be the situation, whoever is going away, if you are going back, you go back. Or if you're going to serve other God, you can go ahead with that. But as for me and my household, we will serve the God alone. And that is the proclamation Joshua has made. So whatever was given in the book of Moses, Joshua was ready to obey, and he was passing them on to his generation and to his household. Then then we move to chapter 24, from 1 to 28. Joshua calls all Israel to him at Shechem, where he asked them to serve the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, rather than other gods. They reaffirm their allegiance to the Lord, and Joshua makes a covenant with them there, erecting a stone as a memorial of the covenant. Okay, Joshua is making a covenant with them. Then we'll come to the last chapter, chapter 24, verse 29 to 33. Last part of the book of Joshua. Here Joshua dies at the age of 110 and is buried in the land he received as an inheritance. The bones of Joseph, which the Israelites brought out of Egypt, are buried at Shechem. The priest Eleazar, the son of Aaron, dies and is buried at Gibeah. So these are the funeral or death happening in the chapter 24. That's the end of the book of Joshua. So in as a summary, if you see, a man commanded by or commissioned by God, he stood for the truth or stood for the commandments of God or the word of God. So he could achieve or he could achieve all the mission entrusted on him. Right? So that is why he could do all the unnatural things. As I have told you earlier, each time if we go through the strategies he adopted, each time it was different. The different strategies he has adopted, that is as per the guidance of God. So same way, if we abide the rule guidance of God, see, we can achieve our goal in our lives. So the Hindus, I just want to name two persons, Joshua and Caleb. They are the two positive person stood for Christ, whatever be the situation. Even at the while dividing the inheritance, Caleb was telling to Joshua, and now I am 80 years old. When I started the church, I was 45 years old. Now also in this age of 80 years old, I have the same vigor as I have started my journey. See, with such a boldness, he is proclaiming his trust in God. That I can say like that, his trust in God, because he knows who has called him and who has promised him, and that is why he is telling you, give me that mountain part or that hill country. I will go and stay there. Give me that hill country as my inheritance. Even Joshua got the hill country as his inheritance. See, God blesses those who abide by the law of the God. Okay. So that's the end of Joshua. So now we'll see a summary of the book of Joshua. 8 minutes video. In that you will see all the entire book of Joshua. This is not made by me. It's there in the YouTube. I just show that 8 minutes video. Just wait. Can you hear this? Just 1 minute, just 1 minute. I think that sound is not coming. Then we'll go through the video itself. Like you can go through. You can. Are you able to see?
So, like Moses, Joshua calls the people to obey the Torah, which means the covenant commands that.
Now you can listen. I mean, you can hear.
The book of Joshua. Let's back up and remember the story so far. So God chose Abraham, and then his family became the people of Israel, who are then enslaved down in Egypt. And so through Moses, God rescued Israel out of Egypt. He made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai, and he brought them through the wilderness. So Israel then camped outside the promised land, and Moses called them to obey God's commands so that they could show all the other nations what God is like. The book of Joshua picks up right after Moses has died, and Israel's ready to enter the land. So the story of Joshua is designed with four main movements. Joshua first leads Israel into the promised land, and then once they're there, they meet all this hostility from the Canaanites, and so they engage them in battle. Then after their victories, Joshua divides up the promised land as the inheritance for the 12 tribes, and then the book concludes with these final speeches that Joshua gives to the people. So let's dive in and we'll see how all of it flows together. The first section begins with Moses' death, and Joshua is appointed as Israel's new leader. And the author intentionally presents Joshua as a new Moses. So like Moses, Joshua calls the people to obey the Torah, which means the covenant commands that they were given at Mount Sinai. And then Joshua sends spies into the land, just as Moses did back in Numbers chapters 13 and 14, except it goes way better this time. In fact, even some Canaanites turn and follow the God of Israel. Joshua then leads all Israel across the Jordan River and into the land. Just like the sea parted for Moses in the Exodus, so here the river Jordan parts and the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant across, leading all Israel with them. Now, in chapter 5, the story transitions. So the people look back to their roots as God's covenant people. And so the new generation is circumcised and they celebrate their first Passover in the land. But then they turn and prepare to go forward. And Joshua has this crazy encounter with a mysterious warrior, who, it turns out, is the angelic commander of God's army. And Joshua asks, "Are you for us or are you for our enemies?" And the warrior responds, "Neither," which shows that the real question here is whether Joshua is on God's side. It makes clear that this whole story is not about Israel versus the Canaanites. Rather, this is God's battle, and Israel is going to play the role of spectators or sometimes supporters in God's plan. which leads to the next section. We find stories about all these conflicts that Israel had with different Canaanite groups. And the first part retells the story of 2 battles in detail, and that's followed by a series of short stories that condense years of battles into a few brief summaries. So the first 2 battles are against Jericho and then Ai, and they offer these contrasting portraits of God's faithfulness versus Israel's failure. At Jericho, Israel is to take a completely passive approach. So they let God's presence in the ark lead them around the city to music for 6 days. And just like Rahab turned to the God of Israel, maybe the people of Jericho would do the same, but they don't. And so on the 7th day, the priests blow the trumpets and the walls come falling down, leading Israel to victory. The point of the story is that God is the one who will deliver his people. Israel simply needs to trust and wait. Now, the next story of the battle at Ai makes the opposite point. So there's this Israelite named Achan, and he steals from Jericho some of the devoted goods that were to belong to God alone, and then he lies about it. It's a pretty lame move after all that God has done for Israel. And so Israel goes into battle with the city of Ai, and they're totally defeated. And it's only after humble repentance and severely dealing with Achan's sin that Israel gains victory. And so together, these 2 stories, they're placed right up front to make an important point. If Israel is going to inherit the land, they have to be obedient and trust in God's commands. They don't get special treatment. Now, the second part of this section begins with the Gibbernites, a Canaanite people group, and they do just what Rahab did as they turn to follow the God of Israel and they make peace with Israel. This is in contrast to all of these other Canaanite kings who start to form alliances and coalitions, and they want to destroy Israel. So Israel engages them in battle, and they win by a landslide. And so this whole section concludes with this summary list of all of these victories won by Moses and then by Joshua. Now, let's stop for a second, because odds are that these stories and the violence in them, they're going to bother you. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you're bound to wonder, like, didn't Jesus say to love your enemies? Why is God declaring war here? So first, why the Canaanites? The main reasons are actually given earlier in the biblical story. It's that the culture of the Canaanites had become extremely morally corrupt, especially when it comes to sex. Go check out Leviticus chapter 18. And they also widely practiced child sacrifice. Go see Deuteronomy chapter 12. And so God didn't want these practices to influence Israel. The Canaanites had to go. Which raises the second question. Did God actually command the destruction of all the Canaanites, like a genocide? So at first glance, you look at the phrases used in these stories. They totally destroyed them. They left no survivor or anything that breathed. But when you look a second time more closely, you'll see that these phrases are clearly hyperbole and not literal. So go back to the original command about the Canaanites in Deuteronomy chapter 7. Israel is first told to drive out the Canaanites, but then to totally destroy them. And then that's followed by commands to not intermarry with them or enter into business deals with them. So you can't marry someone that you've destroyed. I think you get the point. The same idea applies to the stories in Joshua. Look closely. So for example, we're told in Joshua chapter 10 that Israel left no survivors in the cities of Hebron or Debir. But then later in chapter 15, we see these towns and they're still populated by Canaanites. And so what we're seeing is that Joshua fits in with other ancient battle accounts by using non-literal hyperbolic language as part of the narrative style. And so the word genocide doesn't actually fit what we see here, especially in light of the stories about the Canaanites who did turn to the God of Israel, like Rahab or the Gibbernites. God was open to those who would turn to him. The last thing to think about is that these stories mark a unique moment in Israel's history. These battles were limited to the handful of people groups living in the land of Canaan. With all other nations, Israel was commanded by God to pursue peace. Go read Deuteronomy chapter 20. So the purpose of these battle stories was never to tell you, the reader, to go commit violence in God's name. Rather, they show God bringing his justice on human evil at a unique moment in history, and how he delivered Israel from being annihilated by the Canaanites. Now, let's go back to the book's design. After years of battles, we see an aging Joshua, and he starts dividing up the land for the 12 tribes of Israel. And most of this section is like lists of boundary lines. And let's be honest, it's kind of boring. It's like reading a map that has no pictures. But for the Israelites, these lists were super important. This was the fulfillment of God's ancient promises to Abraham that his descendants would inherit the promised land. And so now it was all coming to pass right down to the detail, which leads to the final section. Joshua gives two speeches to the people that are very similar to the final speeches of Moses in Deuteronomy. Joshua reminds them of God's generosity, how he brought them into the land and rescued them from the Canaanites. And so he calls them to turn away from the Canaanite gods and be faithful to the covenant they made. If they do, it will lead to life and blessing in the land. But if they're unfaithful, Israel will call down on itself the same divine judgment that the Canaanites experienced. They'll be kicked off the land into exile. And so Joshua leaves Israel with a choice. What is Israel going to do? That's the big question that looms as the story ends, and that's the book of Joshua.
Hope you all have a wonderful time with this video. Now you got, I hope you got an awareness of the book of So, hope you all had a wonderful time with this video. Hope you understood the book of Joshua. May God enable us to lead a life as Joshua did, an obedient servant of God, an obedient child of God. May God bless you all with all this verse. God bless you.
Thank you, Auntie, for